Harlem, New York, Friday afternoon, February 12, 1965. The meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes. That detail would matter later, because every minute inside that office above the Palm Café carried consequences far beyond the two men sitting across from each other. On one side of the desk sat Bumpy Johnson, 60 years old, ruler of Harlem's underworld, a man who had survived 4 decades through violence, strategy, and fear. On the other side sat Malcolm X, 39 years old, revolutionary, speaker, and marked man. 3 witnesses were present, men trusted enough to hear something that would remain unspoken for decades. This was not a casual conversation. Malcolm was hunted. He knew it. Johnson knew it. Both men understood that assassination was no longer a possibility. It was an approaching certainty. What happened in those 47 minutes did not save Malcolm X's life, but it reshaped how violence, power, and responsibility would be understood inside Harlem's black community for generations. The promise made that day would cost money, territory, and lives not taken, and its impact would last long after both men were gone. By early 1965, Malcolm X was living on borrowed time. After publicly breaking with the Nation of Islam, he became a target of the very organization he had helped build into a national movement. His home had been firebombed, his phone calls were monitored, his movements tracked. Informants warned him repeatedly that assassination teams were active, moving between cities, waiting for the right moment. Malcolm no longer spoke like a man planning a long future. He spoke like someone arranging final matters. Friends noticed the exhaustion in his face, the weight in his voice. He slept little. He trusted almost no one. Yet he continued to speak publicly, knowing every appearance increased the risk. Malcolm believed that if his death was inevitable, then his final actions had to matter more than his survival. That belief shaped everything that followed. When Bumpy Johnson offered him safety, Malcolm did not hear salvation. He heard a test of principles. The question was no longer whether Malcolm could live. The question was whether his life was worth the cost that living would demand. Bumpy Johnson did not make offers lightly. When he did, they were real. His control over Harlem's criminal networks gave him access to money, weapons, and people willing to act without hesitation. Sitting in his office, Johnson laid out the offer plainly. He could eliminate Malcolm's enemies, not just the men stalking him in New York, but the leadership that had ordered the hit. Temple heads, coordinators, even Elijah Muhammad himself. It would be fast, it would be thorough, and it would work. The cost would be high: law enforcement pressure, internal wars, political fallout, but Malcolm would live. His daughters would grow up with a father. His wife would not be widowed. His voice would not be silenced. Johnson was not offering protection out of charity. He respected Malcolm. He believed Malcolm mattered. To Johnson, violence was a tool, not a moral problem. If killing could preserve something valuable, then killing was justified. All he needed was Malcolm's permission. One word: yes. Malcolm X did not hesitate. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and final. He refused. The room fell silent. The 3 witnesses later said the tension was heavier than any violent confrontation they had seen. Malcolm explained that survival was not worth the deaths of dozens of black men. The men hunting him were not monsters, he said. They were confused, misled, manipulated by leaders they trusted. Killing them would only deepen the cycle he had spent his life trying to break. Malcolm understood the consequences of his refusal. He was choosing death, but he was also choosing consistency. He could not preach an end to black-on-black violence while accepting protection built on bloodshed. To live that way would make his message hollow. Johnson, hardened by decades of criminal logic, could not comprehend it. To him, refusing safety was irrational. To Malcolm, accepting it would have been betrayal. Malcolm did not come only to refuse an offer, he came with one of his own. Leaning forward, he asked Johnson to do something far more difficult than revenge. He asked him to change. After Malcolm's death, Johnson was to stop allowing black men to kill black men. No murders over territory, no executions over money or pride. Find other ways, negotiate, apply pressure, use influence, even violence short of killing, but never murder. Malcolm understood how impossible this sounded. Johnson's power was built on fear. Removing murder from the equation threatened the foundation of his empire. But Malcolm insisted that real strength was not measured in bodies, it was measured in restraint. If Johnson changed, others would follow. Young men would learn different rules. The cycle would not end overnight, but it could begin to break. Malcolm was asking Johnson to risk everything, not for profit, but for principle.
Johnson paced his office, wrestling with the request. Violence was not optional in his world. It was structural. Killing established boundaries. It ended disputes. It prevented challenges before they started. A no-kill rule invited attacks from rivals who would see restraint as weakness. Johnson knew what Malcolm was asking could cost him territory, money, and control. Yet something about Malcolm's certainty unsettled him. This was not naive idealism, it was deliberate sacrifice. Malcolm was willing to die rather than compromise his values. That forced Johnson to confront a question he had avoided for decades. What was power for? If power only existed to perpetuate violence, then what was the point of surviving so long? Johnson did not give an immediate answer. Malcolm did not push. He knew seeds sometimes needed time to grow. 9 days later, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom, in front of his wife, in front of his daughters, in front of hundreds of witnesses. 3 black men rushed the stage and opened fire, ending his life with brutal finality. The shock rippled across the world. Harlem teetered on the edge of explosion. Johnson arrived at the hospital to find chaos, grief, and disbelief. Everything Malcolm had warned about had come true. Johnson had failed to save him. More importantly, black men had killed another black man trying to uplift his people. That night, Johnson sat alone, replaying the conversation. Malcolm's words echoed relentlessly. The promise, the request, the impossible challenge. Johnson's instincts screamed for retaliation. He had the means to destroy the Nation of Islam's New York operations. His men expected blood. Instead, Johnson shocked everyone. There would be no revenge, no assassinations, no war. Malcolm had refused protection because he would not accept more black deaths. Johnson would honor that refusal. His associates protested fiercely. They warned that restraint would invite attacks. Johnson cut them off. This was not weakness, he said. It was commitment. Malcolm asked him to stop the cycle. Johnson would try, starting now. It was the first step, not the final one, but it marked a break from everything Johnson had ever done. Implementing the promise was harder than making it. Rivals tested Johnson constantly. Under old rules, they would have been killed. Under the new rule, Johnson used economic warfare, community pressure, and negotiation. Suppliers were cut off. Police scrutiny was redirected. Mediators were brought in. Violence still occurred, but murder was removed as the default solution. Johnson personally trained his people to think differently. Strength, he told them, was not killing, it was control. Every challenge tested the policy. Every success reinforced it. Slowly, Malcolm's method became real. The cost was undeniable. Johnson lost territory. His income dropped significantly. Rivals grew bolder. His personal danger increased. Some saw him as weak. Johnson accepted the losses without complaint. When questioned, his answer was simple.
Malcolm gave his life trying to stop the violence. Losing money was a small price to honor that sacrifice. Johnson understood that keeping the promise meant paying for it every day. When Johnson died in 1968, his successors continued the no-kill principle. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. Violence decreased. Disputes shifted toward mediation. Over time, other organizations adopted similar rules. Criminological patterns showed a measurable reduction in black-on-black organized crime murders compared to earlier decades. The promise outlived the men who made it. Malcolm X did not live to see the results of his final request. Bumpy Johnson did not fully escape the cost of honoring it. But together, through one private conversation, they altered the trajectory of Harlem's underworld. The legacy was not power or profit. It was lives not lost, murders not committed, cycles weakened instead of reinforced. That was the offer Malcolm refused. That was the promise Johnson kept. And that was how history quietly changed.